I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
It returns to me now as a small grey tableau, the sort of unimportant domestic scene that can sit undisturbed in memory for years before one realizes it was the beginning of everything. November had been drizzling for a week without pause, the rain so light it felt like dust rising from the stones rather than falling upon them. North Oxford under that weather took on a muffled tone. The old terraces hunched inward, the hedges sagged, and the windows, even at noon, glowed faintly as if embarrassed to be seen. I had chosen the Randolph for breakfast, a ritual I indulge when cases are still more rumor than fact. I remember the paper spread before me like a patient waiting for examination. The crossword, that silent sparring partner, offered a clue at once pedestrian and disquieting. Absence, 5 letters. I wrote in vacuo, then crossed it out, tried lapse and disliked its pettiness, then let the square remain blank. Some vacancies prefer to stay that way. Lewis had not yet called. My only company was the low clink of cutlery and a voice on the radio describing minor flooding near Banbury. Outside, umbrellas moved like cautious insects between the parked cars. In such moments, one senses Oxford's undercurrent of loneliness, an invisible discipline binding its scholars, widows, and errant detectives alike. I saw her only once before she vanished. Miss Eleanor Marsh, walking past the hotel at the very edge of the pavement, small and upright, carrying a folded umbrella she clearly had no intention of opening. Retired college secretary, lived alone in a Victorian terrace at the far end of Polstead Road. There was something about her gait that made me think of a woman still on duty, as though even solitude required minutes to be taken and filed. Later that same morning, a cleaner, hired for the day, would let herself into Miss Marsh's house to find an arrangement both ordinary and peculiar. An oak chair drawn back from the breakfast table, a pot of tea cooling, a diary open at a date unmarked. Nothing broken, nothing spilled, but a sense, she told the constable, that someone had left mid-sentence. I did not know this yet. At the Randolph, my pen hovered above the crossword, while my mind drifted to the faint smell of beeswax polish and coal smoke that clung to her coat as she passed. What struck me, though I did not understand why, was how she glanced not at the road, but at the upper stories of the hotel, as if she sought a window long closed. A small tilt of the head, the kind of gesture one notices only because one is habitually noticing. I stored it away, a single tile from a mosaic not yet revealed. A student at the next table murmured to his companion about an upcoming lecture on Tennyson. He misquoted a line from In Memoriam, and I, absurdly, corrected it under my breath. The correct cadence ran through my mind like water over worn stone. Grief had always been a matter of rhythm to me, the wrong syllable and everything jar. I underlined the crossword clue once, twice. Absence. I left the hotel before noon, walking under the drizzle along St. Giles, past bicycles chained like penitents to the railings. My shoes squeaked faintly on the wet flagstones. Somewhere behind me, the bells of St. Mary Magdalene rang a quarter-hour off time, their echo slipping into the alleys like a promise no one had asked for. I remember pausing at a bookseller's window to examine a display of remaindered volumes, each spine bent as though trying to look away. Among them a slim Latin anthology I had once used to test undergraduates. On impulse, I read the back and found a misprint. Another small vacancy, another absence. When the call from Lewis came, it was not dramatic. A quiet voice relaying a quiet discovery. A neighbor reporting that Miss Marsh had not been seen, the house showing small disturbances. Nothing violent, yet somehow wrong. Would I care to take a look? I thought again of her umbrella folded against her side, her eyes lifted toward windows invisible to me. I thought of the chair pulled back from the table, though at that point I had not been told of it. The mind arranges its puzzles before the pieces arrive. I closed the paper, left the crossword unsolved, and stepped into the mist. Even now, recalling that morning, I can hear the soft drag of a chair leg across polished boards. It is a sound without urgency, merely a displacement of air and wood, but it carries a kind of farewell. Some clues come not as messages, but as absences, and one learns to listen for the hollow where a life should be. It was Lewis who brought me the file, no larger than a folded newspaper, the sort of case that usually dissolves into nothing by the time the ink dries on the report. We were sitting in my office near the window that looks over St. Giles, the drizzle still seeping down the panes in thin threads. He laid the folder on the desk without ceremony. "Miss Marsh," he said quietly. "Not seen for 2 days." A neighbor thought she heard a kettle whistle, then silence. I opened the file and felt the faintest tightening across the back of my neck. A constable had forced her door that morning. Inside, no body, no blood, no sign of violence. Only a pot of tea still warm and a diary opened at a page marked by a pressed pansy, the oak chair drawn back from the table, a scene too careful to be accidental, yet lacking the theatrics of a staged disappearance. We drove to Polstead Road in silence. North Oxford, under persistent rain, takes on a scent of iron and wet paper, and the terraces lean toward one another like confidants unwilling to speak aloud. Number 12 had lace curtains yellowed at the edges, a front garden clipped to the soil, a brass knocker dulled by years of polite use. Lewis muttered something about a retired college secretary, lived alone, never late with her bills. I listened as one listens to a radio slightly off station. Inside the house, the air was warm but faintly stale, a blend of old books, lavender polish, and the particular sweetness of tea left too long in the pot. A hallway runner, darkened by rainwater, led to a small sitting room where everything seemed arranged for an occupant just stepped out. The diary lay open on a writing desk, the pansy fragile as ash. The chair stood a foot back from the table, a quiet vacancy in the shape of a human life. I touched the diary without reading, noting instead the indentation of a pen's pressure on the previous page. The script slanted sharply to the right, as though in haste or defiance. Lewis remarked on the absence of her handbag. He was right. Umbrella gone too. No coat on the hook, yet the teacup half full, cooling by the minute. I thought of the crossword clue from the morning before, absence, and felt the faint click of a piece moving somewhere out of sight. A small deduction, hardly more than a guess. The pansy pressed at that date was not hers. Miss Marsh preferred violets. I had once seen her pause near a florist's window at Trinity term, ignoring the brighter blooms. A secretary notices her own habits. She would not misfile her flower. Someone else had marked that page, perhaps in mockery, perhaps as a signal. The constable stood by the hearth, shifting his weight as though afraid to disturb the carpet. He said no signs of forced entry beyond his own. I asked about the back door. Locked from within. Windows latched. He shrugged, uncomfortable. Lewis looked to me for a theory. I had none ready. Only a faint image of Miss Marsh's eyes lifting to the hotel window the day before, as if searching for a witness she would never find. I wandered into the narrow kitchen. A teaspoon rested on a folded napkin, its handle aligned perfectly with the edge of the counter. Such order undercuts itself when one detail refuses alignment. The chair pulled back had the effect of a note left on a pillow. Not quite a message, but a deliberate disturbance. Upstairs, her bedroom showed a bed neatly made, a small stack of correspondence tied with green string, and a wardrobe of practical clothes. On the dressing table, a bottle of scent uncapped, the stopper laid on its side as though interrupted mid-gesture. Lavender again, faint and persistent. Lewis asked if she might have gone to visit someone, fallen ill on the way. I said perhaps. But even as I spoke, I was tracing in my mind the pressure marks on the diary page. The pansy, the missing coat, the warm tea, the aligned teaspoon. Small, unremarkable things, but already leaning toward one another like fragments of a sentence not yet spoken. When we left, the constable closed the door gently behind us. The rain had begun again, soft as breath. I stood on the pavement a moment longer than necessary, staring at the brass knocker dulled by years. Number 12 looked exactly as it had when we arrived, but I felt as though the house itself had shifted imperceptibly, pulling back some invisible chair. In my mind, the crossword square remained empty, waiting for a word I could not yet bring myself to write. The case led me, as so many had before, into one of Oxford's older courtyards where the air smelled of wet ivy and library paste. St. Botolph's was a college I'd visited only in passing, a place of high, soot-darkened stone and staircases polished by centuries of anxious shoes. On that particular morning, the drizzle had thickened into a mist that clung to the archways, muting even the sound of our footsteps. Lewis, who dislikes colleges, walked beside me with his coat collar turned up, saying nothing. Inside, the porter's lodge offered warmth but no welcome. A man with a face like worn oak recorded our names without expression. He spoke softly about Miss Marsh as if her absence were a breach of etiquette rather than a cause for concern. Retired 3 years, still came in for the occasional committee. Kept everything tidy. She knew where bodies were buried, he added, then looked away as though the phrase had slipped out of habit. The library smelled of dust and candle wax, though neither was in sight. It was a long room of narrow tables and green lamps, the kind of place where whispers gather in the rafters. Students sat scattered like chess pieces, most pretending to read. One of them, a sharp-faced young man with ink on his fingers, slipped out as we entered. On a side table near the catalogue, drawers lay an envelope without address or seal. Lewis handed it to me. Inside, on a single sheet, the words, "She kept more than minutes." There was also a line about a codicil to the benefactor's will. No signature, no date. I read it twice. The handwriting was disciplined but unfamiliar. I imagined Miss Marsh at her committee desk, noting not only the agenda but the small tremors of reputation and debt beneath it. A secretary who knew too much is a person who may one day disappear. We moved through the stacks. The books smelled of ink long since dried, a scent like scorched sugar. At one shelf, a loose slip of paper fluttered to the floor when I drew out a volume. A list of meeting times, nothing more. But the final entry had been struck through with a heavy pen stroke. Beside it, a tiny mark shaped like a question. I pocketed it without comment. On the upper landing, a commemorative plaque caught my eye. It quoted Tennyson, or tried to. "Kind hearts are more than coronets," it read, omitting the word simple. A minor excision, but one that shifted the line's cadence. I ran my thumb over the carving, thinking of the student and the Randolph, who had also misquoted Tennyson. Coincidence, perhaps, but Oxford thrives on such coincidences, weaving them into a web until one strand trembles differently from the rest. Lewis asked if the codicil might be a rumor. I said perhaps. Yet the unsigned note, the struck-through list, the missing word on the plaque, each felt like a finger tracing a pattern on frosted glass. The trouble lay not in what was written, but in what had been removed. Down in the quad, the bells began to sound noon, their tone muffled by the damp. Through the window, I watched a group of junior dons cross the lawn under umbrellas like slow-moving black sails. One of them glanced up toward the library window, a look so brief it might have been reflex. He carried a leather folio pressed close to his ribs, his hand white at the knuckles. I folded the note back into the envelope. The porter would later claim he had not seen it. Lewis would mutter about ghosts leaving us messages. I only felt the familiar tightening behind the eyes, that faint premonition of a shape forming out of fog. In St. Botolph's, the stones held their silence, but the air smelled of something withheld. Old paper, lavender, and a secret pressed between pages like a flower someone meant to forget. I remember the day as one of thin sunlight, the sort that falls through old glass and makes dust seem deliberate. Lewis and I returned to St. Botolph's not as wanderers, but as interviewers, a role the college's walls accepted without enthusiasm. In such places, truth rarely sits in a single chair. It shifts between seats, polite as any fellow at a high table. Dr. Lionel Keene received us first in a room lined with books whose spines had been chosen more for show than use. He was a man of angles and soft fabrics, urbane enough to disguise his unease but not to erase it. He spoke of Miss Marsh in the mild voice one reserves for a colleague long retired yet faintly feared. She kept everything, he said, every slip and receipt. There was admiration under his complaint, or perhaps only nostalgia for a time when the accounts still balanced. He offered tea he did not drink. When he gestured toward a ledger on his desk, the movement revealed an ink stain on his cuff, shaped like a question mark. I noted it without comment. Margaret Field awaited us in the archives, a room of low ceilings and the smell of paper dried into brittleness. She was beautiful in a way that discouraged admiration, her posture suggesting a door only partially open. She said Miss Marsh had been thorough to the point of obsession, a woman who saw more than was convenient. Her voice, though steady, carried the fatigue of someone holding a pose too long. I felt, against my better judgment, a flicker of interest in the precision of her movements, the way she returned a manuscript to its shelf without glancing, as if guided by memory alone. She mentioned a dinner with Miss Marsh a week before, then corrected herself to 2 weeks. Lewis scribbled the discrepancy, but I simply watched her hands. She wore no ring, yet there was a pale band on her finger, a detail as small as it was unnecessary. We found Harold Wayne in a side corridor near the college gardens, a man whose dismissal had been described to me in vague phrases. His jacket smelled faintly of soil and old tobacco. He spoke of Miss Marsh with an affection almost paternal, then darkened when pressed about his last day at St. Botolph's. Something about a dispute over locked sheds, over who had keys and who did not. He said he had seen her walking near the river recently, or perhaps only thought he had. His eyes slid sideways as he spoke, like a man who knows the difference between a weed and a flower, but cannot name it aloud. Each account fit like a map copied from memory. Familiar contours, missing roads. Keene's version placed Miss Marsh at a committee meeting the day before she disappeared. Margaret's at a dinner she could not date. Wayne's by the river at dusk. 3 polite suspects, 3 plausible stories, none quite overlapping. The college, with its staircases curling like question marks, seemed to listen without revealing which door opened onto the truth. As we left the archives, I paused at a notice board. Among the curling papers, a lost umbrella, a call for volunteers, lay a crossword puzzle clipped from the Times, half completed in a precise, almost secretarial hand. One clue circled in pencil. Record, 7 letters. No answer given. I felt the faint stir of deduction. Miss Marsh had been a recorder, yes, but the word also meant disc, album, memory. To keep more than minutes might mean more than meeting notes. It might mean a record of another kind altogether. Outside, the thin sunlight had already dulled to pewter. Lewis asked which of them I believed. I said none, or perhaps all. Truth in Oxford often wears an academic gown, I added, and pockets its hands before speaking. We walked past the garden where damp leaves pressed their scent into the air. I thought of Margaret's pale ring mark, of Keene's ink-stained cuff, of Wayne's sideways glance, and of the circled clue waiting for an answer. Some puzzles begin not with a question, but with a silence shaped like one. It was a neighbor's memory, offered not with urgency, but with the hesitant care of someone unaccustomed to speaking aloud what she half believes she imagined. We were standing at her back gate, the mist rising from the river beyond, like steam from a kettle left on too long. She said she had seen an empty chair in Miss Marsh's garden a few nights before, turned to face the water as though awaiting a guest. She thought she heard voices. Miss Marsh's, recognizable even at dusk, and another lower, blurred by the distance. They were not shouting, she said. They were speaking softly, as though rehearsing a secret. I pictured it as she spoke, the chair angled toward the river, the last of the daylight on its arms, Miss Marsh leaning forward, a man's shape indistinct beside her. In such scenes everything is suggestion, the imagination fills in what the eye cannot. Yet the detail of the chair struck me. People rarely move garden furniture without purpose. Lewis wandered along the bank while I remained in the garden. The grass was wet and smelled faintly of iron. A narrow path led to a bench under a hawthorn, its thorns glossy with rain. From there the river could be seen sliding past, dark as ink. I crouched to examine the soil near the chair's legs. No obvious footprints, but a faint impression of something dragged, a narrow groove curving back toward the house. Inside, the sitting room was as we had left it. Diary, pansy, chair pulled back. Yet, in a drawer of the sideboard, I found an envelope marked only with the college crest. Inside lay a photograph of the garden fete at St. Botolph's, the kind of institutional merriment arranged for benefactors and students who prefer to see tradition as harmless. Miss Marsh sat at a trestle table with a ledger open before her, looking away from the camera. Behind her stood 3 figures, Keene, smiling too widely, Margaret Field, half-turned as if distracted, and Harold Wayne, gaze lowered to the grass. One face, at the edge of the frame, had been torn away with a jagged thumb's precision. The rip left a white crescent like a small moon over the crowd. I held the photograph to the window light. The torn edge caught the drizzle's dim glow. Whoever removed that face did so deliberately, but the gesture's meaning remained obscure. Lewis returned and asked what I had found. "Only ghosts," I said, sliding the picture back into its envelope. On the desk beside the diary lay a crossword puzzle cut from the Times. Miss Marsh had filled nearly all of it in her meticulous hand, every letter upright, unhurried, except for one clue, circled twice in pencil. Pulled back 6 letters, blank squares waiting for a word. I traced the circle with my thumb. The clue sat there like a reprimand, as though she had paused mid-thought and never resumed. It occurred to me then that the chair in the garden and the chair in the sitting room were not separate images, but halves of a single thought. Something pulled back, something left open. The photograph with its torn face, the crossword with its unanswered clue, the neighbor's half-heard conversation, each a fragment of a pattern whose shape had not yet declared itself. We left the house as the mist thickened into rain. The neighbor closed her gate softly behind us, as if to keep the memory from escaping. Walking back to the car, I could feel the photograph against my palm through the envelope, the torn edge like a secret still sharp enough to cut. The crossword remained unsolved in my mind, the empty squares waiting, the word pulled back refusing to arrive. Oxford lay ahead, wet stone and dim lamps, its silence pressing in like an unanswered question. The bursar summoned us to his office as though he were granting an audience, rather than providing evidence. The room smelt of old varnish and damp velvet. A clock ticked with the obstinate patience of a man who never hurried. On his desk lay a single sheet of paper, its edges faintly browned. He pushed it toward me with a small ceremonial gesture. "A poem," he said, "found in the archives, written, he believed, in Miss Marsh's own hand." It seemed to implicate Dr. Keene in irregularities of the college. Accounts he did not say scandal. He preferred misconduct the way some people prefer drizzle to rain. I read the Latin once, slowly. It was elegant but oddly mannered, like a borrowed accent. The lines accused without naming, hinting at a benefaction siphoned for private use, ending with a couplet about the keeper of minutes becoming the keeper of gold. Lewis shifted beside me, glancing between the bursar and the page. I translated aloud in my head, then again more carefully, and already small doubts began to stir. Certain turns of phrase belonged not to secretaries, but to classicists. One verb was archaic even for Oxford. Miss Marsh's Latin, as far as I had known it, was practical and spare. This was theatrical. I folded the page once, twice, and slipped it back to the bursar. He asked if it meant what he thought. I said perhaps, but perhaps is a word that leaves more out than it admits. Afterwards, in the archives, Margaret Field waited among the shelves like a figure in a photograph. She had sent word she wished to speak privately. Lewis excused himself with relief. She stood by a window clouded with condensation, her fingers resting on the sill as though steadying herself. Without preamble, she told me about the affair. A married don from another college, long ended but still whispered about. Miss Marsh might have known, she said, might even have threatened to tell. Her eyes lifted to mine only once, quickly. I listened. The confession had the shape of disclosure, but not its pulse. Her words arrived neat, arranged like files already alphabetized. She said she had loved him, that she had been young, that it had cost her everything. Each sentence sounded polished by rehearsal. I thought again of the bursar's poem, its neat couplets and suspect vocabulary. Both, perhaps, were performances written for an audience. Margaret moved closer, so near I caught the faint scent of paper and some dry perfume. She asked if this changed anything. I said it gave context. She looked at me a moment longer, then turned back to the misted glass. Her hand left a small print on the pane, a mark quickly blurred by the damp. While she spoke, I noticed a stack of catalogued pamphlets on the table. One slip of paper protruded at an odd angle. It was a borrowing record in Miss Marsh's hand, the date of return left blank. The title of the book, De Falsis Testimonies, On False Testimonies. A coincidence, perhaps, but the timing fit the week before her disappearance. I tucked that small fact into the pocket of my mind, next to the archaic verb in the poem and the pale mark on Margaret's finger. Outside, the rain had begun again, pattering softly on the roof of the quad. Lewis waited by the gate, coat collar up, expression half incredulous. He asked if I believed her. I said she wanted me to. He asked about the poem. I said it was good Latin, but not necessarily hers. As we walked away, the bells of St. Botolph's struck a hesitant chime, as though uncertain of the hour. I thought of Miss Marsh, seated at her desk, recording minutes no one would read, and of the poem accusing without proof, and of Margaret's confession offered like a sealed envelope. Pieces that looked like answers, but might only be decoys. The crossword clue from her sitting room returned to me, pulled back. Some truths are like that. A curtain drawn for a moment, revealing only another curtain beyond. I had allowed myself that evening the small luxury of a seat in the dress circle at the new theatre, a place whose gilt and velvet never quite conceal the draught rising from the street below. Outside, Oxford lay wet and shimmering, the pavements shining like ink under the lamps. Inside, the orchestra tuned in a discordant hush, and I felt, as I often did in such moments, a kind of melancholy anticipation, as if music might unlock a truth I'd been circling for days. The opera was an old favorite, a story of mistaken vows and hidden letters. The soprano sang with a clarity that made the air tremble. In the second act, a line drifted upward from the stage. Hearts are more than coronets. Echoing, almost word for word, the misquoted Tennyson carved on the plaque at St. Botolph's. The coincidence was so exact it startled me. I closed my eyes and heard again the student in the Randolph misreciting the same line. 3 echoes in as many days. It was not proof of anything, yet it felt like the moment when a crossword's scattered clues begin, without warning, to lean toward a single solution. At the interval, I moved to the foyer, the carpet soft underfoot, the crowd perfumed with wine and damp coats. Through the tall windows, I saw the street beyond, and there, half in shadow, Margaret Field standing close to Harold Wayne. Her head tilted up, his bent low. They spoke with the urgency of people sharing a secret too heavy to hold. She touched his sleeve once, a brief, almost supplicating gesture, before stepping back. Their stories of the night Miss Marsh vanished had never aligned perfectly, but until that moment I had treated the discrepancies as noise rather than signal. Watching them, I realized one of them must have lied, or both. Margaret had placed herself at a dinner far from the river. Wayne had claimed to glimpse Miss Marsh at dusk. Yet here they were together, a week later, conspiring at the edge of the opera crowd as though rehearsing their lines. I slipped outside without drawing attention. The rain had begun again, soft as the dust from old books. Margaret saw me first, her expression rearranging itself with professional swiftness. She said something light about the performance, but her voice carried a tremor too delicate for Lewis to notice. Wayne muttered a greeting, eyes on the pavement, then walked away without looking back. Margaret followed with a glance that asked for patience but offered no explanation. Back inside, the bell sounded for the third act. I remained in the corridor, coat over my arm, mind, turning the line from the libretto, the plaque, the student, the photograph with its torn face, the crossword clue pulled back, fragments circling the same unnamed center. It was then my phone vibrated against my palm. Lewis's voice, low and careful, a body found in the chair well. "Not Miss Marsh," he said at once, as though anticipating my question. A man, unidentified, pulled from the water near the boathouses. I heard the echo of river rain down the line, felt the theater's warmth pressing at my back. I told him I would come. He began to describe the scene, but I cut him off. Some details are better met than heard. Sliding the phone into my pocket, I stood a moment longer by the foyer window. The stage resumed behind me, the orchestra rising into its overture, but I watched the street where Margaret and Wayne had stood. Their absence seemed to leave a darker shape in the air, like the mark a chair leaves on carpet after it is moved. When at last I stepped out, the rain blurred the neon of the theater sign into unreadable streaks. The music, faint through the door, carried the misquoted line once more into the night. I walked toward the car with the sense of a pattern tightening, but without yet knowing what word would fill the empty squares. Back at the terrace, the air felt heavier, as if the walls had absorbed the November damp and were exhaling it back into the rooms. Lewis had gone ahead to speak with a neighbor again, leaving me alone in the narrow sitting room where the smell of lavender had grown faint but stubborn, like a memory resisting erasure. The diary still lay on the desk exactly as we had left it. I sat down, loosened my coat, and opened it once more. Her handwriting met me like an echo from a long corridor, neat, right-leaning, unshowy. Yet the day she vanished was no longer there. Between two dated entries, a leaf had been neatly torn, leaving a faint, serrated edge. Paper does not vanish of its own accord. I tilted the diary to the window light and saw, pressed into the paper beneath, an indentation of words that must have been written hard, as though under strain. He came for the chair. The rest trailed off into a swirl of pen strokes, unreadable. I traced the marks with my finger, thinking of the garden chair facing the river, of the chair pulled back from the breakfast table, of the chair as symbols or clue. Chairs hold weight, I thought. They remember who has sat in them. The room creaked once above me, perhaps the wind. I imagined Miss Marsh writing late at night, pressing too hard, tearing the page by mistake or in intention, slipping it into some hiding place. The diary's scent of ink and dried pansy drifted upward. I closed it, placed my hand flat upon the cover, and listened to the rain pattering against the window. Later at St. Botolph's, the archives breathed their usual chill. Margaret Field was absent. Only the low hum of a dehumidifier filled the silence. I wandered the shelves without plan, following, an instinct born less of logic than of weariness. In the donation ledgers, volumes bound in dull brown cloth. One page protruded slightly, as though the book itself had begun to speak. I drew it out carefully. It was the missing diary page, folded once and slipped between entries of small bequests. A clock, a collection of coins, a scholarship fund. Her handwriting again, but this time less composed. The ink pooled at the beginnings of letters. The benefactor's secret, it read, followed by 3 short lines of figures and a Latin tag I recognized from the bursar's poem, but in a different form. Then nothing. No signature, no date. I stood there with the page between my fingers, the smell of old paper rising like a ghost. Someone had moved it here deliberately, choosing a ledger of donations as a hiding place. A kind of irony Miss Marsh herself might have enjoyed. I thought of her careful minutes at meetings, the ways she would note not only who spoke, but who remained silent. She had left this page where someone searching for money would eventually look. Lewis found me a few minutes later, asking what kept me. I said only that the diary had not been complete. He glanced at the paper, but I did not hand it over. Some clues, once shown, hardened too quickly into conclusions. We left the archives by a side door. The quad lay empty, its grass slick with rain. A porter crossed with an umbrella held low, his shape blurred into the mist. In my pocket, the diary page felt strangely warm, as though it had been waiting for my hand. The words, "He came for the chair," and the benefactor's secret circled in my mind like 2 ends of a rope not yet tied. Back at the car, Lewis asked if I had found what I wanted. I said not yet. But as I spoke, I realized I was already fitting the torn photograph, the Latin poem, Margaret's rehearsed confession, and the missing diary page together, like pieces from different puzzles that might, if arranged carefully enough, form a new picture. The rain hissed softly on the roof above us, and in that sound I heard again the faint drag of a chair across a wooden floor, an absence calling attention to itself. I remember the hour precisely because it had no color. Late afternoon at the terrace, the curtains drawn against a rain that never seemed to end, my desk lamp casting a pale circle on the papers spread before me. The photograph lay on top, its torn edge no longer a curiosity, but a provocation. I had looked at it a dozen times without seeing it. That day, perhaps because of the grey light, I finally did. The fate at St. Botolph's. Miss Marsh seated with her ledger, Keen's careful smile, Margaret Field half-turned, Wayne's eyes lowered, and at the edge, the missing face. I held the photograph closer, running a thumb along the jagged gap. A fragment of a collar remained, a faint glint of a tie pin shaped like a small cross. Not Keen's style at all. The bursar, however, wore such a pin the day he handed me the Latin poem. In my mind, I saw his hand pushing the paper toward me, the same pin catching the lamp's glow. The torn-away face was his, not Keen's. A small shift, but like a chess piece moved 3 squares back, it altered the whole board. I sat back, letting the rain's whisper fill the room. A minor detail revisited. The torn face belonged to the man who had offered me a poem implicating another. Why remove one's own likeness from a harmless photograph, unless it was no longer harmless? Beside the photograph lay Miss Marsh's crossword. I'd left it unsolved for days, respecting its silence. Pulled back 6 letters. I traced the circled clue with a pen, then wrote the letters out as if rearranging furniture in a bare room. The phrase broke apart, then reassembled. Black pulp. The words looked odd in my handwriting, like a code whispered in a dream. Black pulp. a phrase I'd heard once in the archives, describing a series of rare edition books bound in dark, almost fibrous paper. Miss Marsh had catalogued them years ago for a private benefactor. They were notorious for their hidden compartments, a binder's whim from the 19th century. I remembered Margaret's offhand remark about a collection no one had touched since Miss Marsh retired. The benefactor's secret, the diary page had called it. I closed my eyes and pictured the archive shelves, the dull brown ledgers, the narrow aisle where the air smelled of damp cloth and forgotten ink. Somewhere among those black pulp volumes, a codicil might still be waiting, folded into a hollowed spine or slipped behind a false end paper. The bursar's poem, Margaret's confession, Wayne's evasions, all might have been elaborate misdirections to keep me from that simple thought. Lewis came in from the rain, shaking his coat, asking if I'd found anything. I said only that sometimes one must read a photograph the way one reads a poem, twice and then backwards. He looked at me as he does when he suspects I am being deliberately obscure. Perhaps I was. When he left again, I returned to the photograph, the crossword, the diary page. Each object held its own silence, but their silences now leaned toward one another. The bursar's torn face, the anagram of black pulp, the chair in the garden. Small things, each overlooked until they began to glimmer faintly, like wet stones in a riverbed. Outside, dusk thickened into early night. The lamp's glow turned the photograph's surface glossy, making the torn edge gleam like a wound. I slipped both the photograph and the crossword into my coat pocket. The rain on the window sounded almost like paper being turned. I thought of the archives waiting in their quiet cloister of rows of black pulp books with spines unbroken for years. The codicil, if it existed, might still be there, folded into a darkness of paper and secrecy. I rose, feeling the stiffness of too many hours bent over puzzles. A minor detail revisited had become, perhaps, the hinge of the case. Yet even as the pattern began to form, I knew enough to distrust its neatness. The chair remained pulled back, the garden empty, the benefactor's secret still unread. In Oxford, some truths hide not behind doors, but between the pages of books, where only silence and patience can find them. I met the bursar in his office at dusk, when the windows of St. Botolph's reflected nothing but the lamps inside and the rain beyond. He had asked for the meeting with an air of resignation, as though the hour itself were a formality. The air smelled faintly of sealing wax and damp carpet. On his desk, the ledger of donations lay open to a blank page, a pen balanced across the gutter like a bridge no one dared cross. He began before I asked. Yes, the poem was his. No, it was not in Miss Marsh's hand. He had written it to point me away from himself and toward Keene, who he said had already ruined the college's finances enough to look guilty without assistance. His voice was calm, too calm for a confession, the way some men recite liturgy they no longer believe. He had heard rumors of a codicil, he said, a hidden clause in the benefactor's will that might redirect a fortune to someone unnamed. He had only wanted to find it before it fell into worse hands. I asked about the chair in the rare book room, the one no one had sat on in years. He looked up then, his eyes pale and steady. Yes, he knew of the secret drawer. Miss Marsh had once shown him the mechanism in an unguarded moment, thinking perhaps it a curiosity. He had meant to recover the codicil from it, he said, but she had disappeared before he could. He swore he had not harmed her. The words hung in the room without echo. I believed him more than I wished. His hands trembled not from guilt, but from age and a lifetime of deferred ambition. Yet even as he spoke, I could see Margaret Field's brittle confessions arranging themselves like props on a stage. The affair, the half-truths about her meetings with Miss Marsh, the glances with Wayne outside the opera. All of it a story, rehearsed to seem like motive, to appear as though she were the one in danger, rather than the one playing a part. The bursar leaned back, the chair creaking softly. He said Miss Marsh had been meticulous to the end, that she had once whispered the benefactor's secret might outlive them all. He smiled faintly, as if at a private joke whose humor had soured. I noted the tie pin at his collar, the same glint that had matched the torn face in the photograph. A man who erases his own image but leaves his pin behind is either careless or tired of pretending. I left him with his ledger still open and walked the cloister alone. Rain slicked the stones until they looked like ink. Somewhere a porter locked a door. The sound carried like a muted bell. My mind turned to Wayne, silent under questioning, eyes sliding sideways. A gardener knows where to dig, but also where not to. If Margaret had needed someone to move, the codicil, to lift a chair or shift a ledger without attracting notice, Wayne would have been the natural accomplice. At the gate, Lewis waited, asking what the bursar had said. I told him enough, not all. He asked if I thought the man had killed her. I said no. The pattern had shifted again. Guilt no longer sat in the bursar's lap. As we walked toward the car, the college bells rang an uneven chime, each note arriving a fraction late, as though unsure of its cue. In my pocket at the crossword from Miss Marsh's desk felt heavier than paper. Pulled back, black pulp, the benefactor's secret, the chair in the rare book room. Margaret's cool eyes at the opera, Wayne's silence by the river, pieces of a tapestry showing themselves edge by edge. I thought of Miss Marsh, the woman who kept more than minutes, who pressed a pansy into a diary page and wrote, "He came for the chair," before tearing it out. Somewhere she was still alive or already beyond reach. I could not tell. But the codicil, folded into its dark paper hiding place, waited as patient as Oxford itself. And I, walking under its rain-slick archways, felt again the familiar ache of knowing a pattern without yet holding its center. I have replayed that night so often, it has lost the shape of narrative and become more like a slow movement of music, notes drifting in and out of place until, quite suddenly, the theme reveals itself. It was late when Lewis and I returned to the terrace, the rain finally broken into a mist that glimmered under the street lamps. The house waited with its curtains drawn, the door closed as if merely dozing. Yet the key was still in the lock where the constable had left it. Inside, the air held a different weight, the lavender now sour, the faint odor of damp stone rising from below. My eyes went at once to the chair at the breakfast table, still pulled back. For days it had been a tableau of absence. Now it felt like a mark on a map. She had risen from it, I thought, and what happened next had turned her life into a footnote. I moved through the rooms without speaking. Lewis stayed by the door, sensing something in my silence. Down the narrow hall, a cupboard door stood slightly ajar. No constable had mentioned it. I touched the handle. A faint draught of colder air rose from the seam, carrying a smell of iron and paper long stored. As I bent to look, I heard, from far below, a sound so small it could have been memory, the scrape of a shoe or a breath pulled through dry lips. I straightened, heart slow but heavy. Lewis asked what it was. I said perhaps a cellar. We had seen no entrance before, but the house was old. Servants once needed somewhere to keep coal. I opened the door fully. A narrow stair descended into darkness, the air cold enough to fog my glasses. Each step creaked like a question. At the bottom, a low space stretched beneath the kitchen. Against one wall stood the missing garden chair, and beside it, on a folded blanket, Miss Marsh herself. She was not dead. Her eyes opened at the sound of our arrival, but did not widen. She seemed already to have calculated that rescue would come too late to restore anything but survival. 2 days in that cellar had drawn her face into a delicate mask of weariness, but she was upright, even dignified, like a teacher waiting for a late student to finish his excuses. I crouched beside her. She whispered water, then shook her head as though refusing pity. Lewis brought her up the stairs slowly, his arm under hers. I followed, feeling the faint tremor of her steps through the wood. In the sitting room, she sank into the pulled-back chair and closed her eyes. It was then, seeing her seated again, that the night arranged itself in my mind. Margaret, brittle under the strain of secrets, fearful that Miss Marsh would expose both her affair and the small sums siphoned from a fund no one audited. Wayne, loyal to Margaret and perhaps resentful of his dismissal, enlisted to retrieve the codicil hidden in the rare bookroom's chair. Miss Marsh surprising them as they tried to move it, rising from her own chair like a figure from a ledger refusing to be erased. A struggle, a fall, not murder, but panic. They had carried her here, locked her below, thinking perhaps to return before anyone noticed. On the table beside her diary lay a folded page I had not seen before. In her handwriting, faint but steady, the words "he came for the chair," followed by a single Latin word, meaning witness. She had left it where she knew I would find it, even if she did not live to explain it. Outside, the rain had stopped. The street glistened as though washed clean, but smelled of damp stone and soot. An ambulance arrived without siren. Lewis spoke softly to the paramedics. Miss Marsh allowed herself to be helped, still upright, her gaze passing over me without reproach. When the house was empty again, I remained in the doorway, listening to the echo of our footsteps fading down the stair to the cellar. The chair sat pushed back from the table, waiting. Some truths arrive not as revelations, but as reconstructions, glimpsed only after the living have been brought up from the dark. And even then, as I closed the door behind me, I knew the pattern was not complete, only clearer, like a page held to the light where the handwriting shows through from the other side. I saw her once more, before she slipped back into the half-light where Oxford stores its inconvenient guardians. Miss Marsh sat upright in a hospital chair, hands folded as if at a committee, the drip line trembling like a string on an unseen instrument. She had been found in time, yet spoke as though time were nothing. I thanked her for surviving. She said survival was a clerical matter, not a moral one. She would not press charges. "The college's secrets," she murmured, "matter more than my safety." Her voice had the calm of someone who has already weighed the cost and entered it neatly into a ledger. Margaret visited only once. She stood at the foot of the bed like a student who had failed an exam she herself set. No words passed between them. Afterward, she sent a short note of resignation to the warden and left Oxford on the next train, taking with her a reputation folded as neatly as a blouse in a suitcase. I imagined her watching the spires recede, her brittle poise dissolving into the carriage window. Wayne did not appear at all. Lewis said he had gone to work in the seasonal orchards near Banbury. A gardener's instinct, perhaps, to vanish into soil when the weather turns. When the formal statements were done, when even Lewis had drifted home, I returned to the Randolph. The same table, the same paper spread before me like an old adversary. Outside, rain smeared the windows into soft bars. The crossword waited, its empty squares no longer abstract but echoing the rooms of the terrace, the gaps in testimony, the hollow between what was done and what was said. I filled the easy clues first, as one tidies a desk before writing a resignation letter. Then the last word stared up at me, the one that had begun it all, absence, 7 letters. I wrote present. The paradox pleased me for a moment, then curdled. Presence can be as voiding as absence. A chair can be occupied and still feel empty. The hotel's muted hum went on. A waiter setting glasses to dry, a tourist asking about punting in the drizzle. I sat there, pen uncapped, whiskey untouched, reading the grid as if it might yield more than words. A minor deduction drifted through me. Miss Marsh had pressed the pansy at that date not as a marker but as a memory. She had known someone would read it, perhaps even me. A secretary keeps minutes. A witness keeps silences. Across the room, a couple debated the opera schedule. One of them misquoted Tennyson, the same line again, "Hearts are more than coronets." The cadence fell wrong. I corrected it under my breath, an old reflex. Outside, a cab splashed through a puddle and the sound rose like a sigh through the glass. I thought of the chair in the rare book room, the hidden drawer, empty now but still capable of holding something. I thought of Margaret's pale finger where a ring had been, of Wayne's sideways glance, of the bursar erasing his own face from a photograph. Pieces of a puzzle solved but not restored. Miss Marsh alive but diminished, her loyalty to the college intact as an old habit. Closing the paper, I looked at the single word present inked in the last square. No triumph in it, only a quiet arrival where a vacancy had been. I paid my bill, left the glass still full, and walked out into the rain. Later, in the quiet of my flat, the case returned not as narrative but as image. A room smelling of lavender and damp stone, a diary pressed open by a pansy, a chair drawn back from a table waiting for someone to return. In my mind, I pushed the chair in again. The wood scraped softly across the floor, a sound more final than any verdict. Yet even with the chair tucked neatly beneath the table, the room felt no less empty.